Hello, and welcome to the program. I'm Gigi Kopelak. My guest today is Alex Tureaud. I first met Alex at an art gallery where he was showing his paintings, and we have since become friendlier with other art venues that we're involved in. I have a couple of his paintings I'd like to show. I find that his work is both interesting and a bit mystifying. For instance, why is it that this mother and child have no face? And what is it about these two figures that they're morphing into the background? Now, usually on this program, we show the work of our artist guest, and we learn their story through their work. Today, we will learn about Alex's story, but in a very different, but I think a very interesting way. So let me welcome you, Alex. Thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure. And I went to a lecture that you gave once, and I thought it was so interesting because you began telling the story of your ancestral background in Louisiana. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, I'm a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, and I come from a rather unique culture. That's a blended culture of French settlers and African slaves. And Louisiana was a very important colony for France. And because of the rich, fertile land there where the Mississippi River empties into the Gulf of Mexico, with plantations for sugar and rice and cotton. And my family started in one of the parishes, which would be a county in New York or Connecticut. We call them parishes, and about 30 miles north of New Orleans, with an African slave woman and a plantation owner. And my great-great-grandfather was a product of that cohabitation, and he remained a slave for all of his life, but when the Civil War came, he fought for the North and became a state legislator during Reconstruction. So my history is one of what we call French Creole people of color history and culture, which was predominant in the settlement of New Orleans and in the state of Louisiana.
Well, I thought it was interesting. There is a definition of the word Creole, which is it a Portuguese word? Did you say it was?
Yeah, it's well, the word, as I understand it, is a derivation of a Portuguese word that meant made in the New World. And so that Creole meant that if you were a European and you had a child, they just said, oh, it's a Creole child, to distinguish a European-born child from a child born in the New World, which would be the Caribbean or North America or whatever. And then it morphed into a Creole chair or a Creole house. And then somewhere along the way, with the miscegenation and the racial mixing with blacks and Native Americans and Europeans, there grew a culture, especially in the southern tier of the United States and especially in New Orleans, of people of color who had similar religion. They were Catholic, they were mixed race, and they spoke French. And so those people became Creoles of color. There were also white Creoles. But over the years, the white people who call themselves Creoles did not keep that identity or that culture going, basically because they didn't have to. They could move and live where they wanted. The Creoles of color were segregated after the war, although there was a period of time when they could vote if they owned property. But after the Civil War and after Reconstruction, the vote was taken away from free people of color, as they were called, and they were segregated. And anyone who had any identity or one drop of blood, as they say, was considered black and segregated again. Mm-hmm. So those people were forced to live in certain neighborhoods and do certain types of work. So that culture was kept intact.
But previous to that, they were free.
Yes.
And they owned land, and
right.
and I think it was interesting you talked about when they became a state, They couldn't decide what to do.
In 1803, Louisiana was purchased by the United States. Napoleon, who was ruling then, and it was owned by France, wanted to go back to Haiti to reclaim Haiti. Haiti had had a revolution, and Toussaint Louverture took over the island. Many of the free people of color in Haiti came to Louisiana because it was a French-speaking colony. Many of them were people of great wealth and culture, and they brought slaves with them, and they were people of color, and they were free people of color. And so they had privileges that slaves did not have, but they didn't have the same privileges as white people had.
Okay.
So there was a whole conglomeration of a mixture of people, and when the United States bought the whole central part of the United States, which was Louisiana Territory, and of course they made Louisiana the southern part of the state with New Orleans. Although it was Louisiana purchase was in 1803, it wasn't until 1812 that the United States agreed to let Louisiana become a state, because it was so mixed up with the language and the miscegenation and the different racial groups. The United States and the Northerners and the people who were in other parts of the country couldn't figure out how they were going to get this group of cultures to blend into. So what they did was they sent many what we called Americans to Louisiana and to New Orleans to help Americanize the cultures.
Okay, and then we let them be a state.
Yes, and then they became a state in 1812.
Now you have become very interested in all of this ancestry because of something that you have done recently.
Yes.
Which is
Yeah, I've been having a wonderful time because after 12 years of research and working with a co-author, Dr. Rachel Emanuel in Baton Rouge, who works at the Southern University Law Center, we finally finished a book about this historical time in Louisiana that focuses on my father, who was the preeminent civil rights attorney in Louisiana for more than 40 years. And the book is really a biographical, a personal story of his life, but it tells a story of the Creole culture and the civil rights movement in Louisiana from the 1840s up to the time of his death in 1972. And the book is called A More Noble Cause. It's a personal biography of A.P. Tureaud, Sr., and his struggle for civil rights in the United States and in Louisiana during the 40s, 50s, 60s, and early 70s.
Right. And there's a reason that you don't use his first name, okay, A.P.
Yes.
Well, you're a junior,
Yes.
but you are Alex.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, as I understand it, my father was called Alex by his family. But when he eventually left Louisiana and in search of an education, there were no high schools in New Orleans for black kids. They couldn't go beyond the 8th grade when he was he wanted to be a high school graduate. He was one of 12 children, and his siblings were basically, his male siblings were basically skilled craftspeople, skilled laborers. They were bricklayers and carpenters and plasterers. He didn't want that. He was more of an intellectual. So he left Louisiana, went to Chicago, eventually New York, and then went to Washington, where he worked in the law library for the Department of Justice, which serves the Supreme Court. And I think that was part of the motivation for him to become a lawyer. And so he did become a lawyer. And when he finished from Howard University Law School, which was one of the oldest and most prestigious black law schools in the country, and it still is, he came back to Louisiana, and his professors told the law students, if you're going into segregated environments and courts and practicing law, you will be called many things by the judges, by your opponents. Don't use your first name, use initials. And so he converted himself into professionally A.P. Tureaud. And when I was born, I just became A.P. Tureaud Jr., but he was known throughout the South and Louisiana as A.P. Tureaud.
Okay. But he had an interesting, I think he went to Chicago first, you said, and he was a vaudevillian for a while. And he
He left at a very young age. He had never left the state of Louisiana until he wanted to go to high school.
Was he the only one of the 12 children that
He was
did?
the only one that ever went to college. He had one sister who finished from high school. He had 4 other sisters who didn't go beyond the 6th grade. And he had brothers who also never finished high school. But they were like his father. His father was a carpenter who became a contractor.
Okay.
And his brothers were very skilled carpenters and bricklayers and plasterers. Yes, he went to Chicago as a strike breaker on the Illinois Central Railroad at 17 or 18 and realized that that was a dangerous situation. And friends of the family got him out of that situation in Chicago. He worked in a steel mill, and that was dangerous. And then he eventually got to go to New York, where he had an older brother who was working on a ship line that went from New Orleans to New York. And he didn't really know where he was going, but he was looking for a high school education and hopefully a college career. He worked as a vaudevillian with his brother. He loved the theater, and he also washed dishes and worked in kitchens.
Yeah, but you can understand in a way the theater and a lawyer, you know, like
Yeah, so,
together.
and he was a very quiet-spoken, self-effacing guy. And he was an observer. He loved to observe human behavior and watch how things happen. But he was smart, and he had taken a civil service exam before he left New Orleans and was notified that he had passed the exam and was being offered a position in the law library in Washington, D.C. of the library that serves the state Supreme Court and Department of Justice. That was a really big deal. So he went to Washington, traveled by himself. He was probably 18 or 19 at the time.
I think we have some pictures of him when he was younger. And I remember you said that they always dressed. He always
Yes,
dressed.
the Creoles had a habit of being very well dressed and very proud of their appearance.
Mm-hmm.
And they always had hats. The men always wore hats, and the women all dressed. They made their own clothing, although his family was a working class family. And even though they only went to, some of them, 4th or 5th grade, they read. They knew how to read. They said once you go to, if you knew how to read, write, and do math, you could do anything. So once they learned how to read, write, and do math, they educated themselves. They read newspapers, they read books, they became involved in the political process.
Mm-hmm.
And they all wanted to vote because they knew that voting was a way you could get ahead and change society and also change the segregated status of your existence in the South.
Yeah. So he gets to the law library and he sees all these lawyers coming in.
Yeah, he met Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was serving on the Supreme Court. So he had a chance to interact with people, to read, to be exposed to a very high level of intellectual, legal decision making.
Mm-hmm.
And he understood the Constitution and realized that the Constitution was the way for his people, for our people, to secure their rights, that the Constitution should apply to everyone. It wasn't just written for white people. It was written, it says, we, the people of the United, everyone.
Everyone.
But it had to be pursued, and he believed in that. He believed in that, and he used that when he returned to the South throughout his career.
And he was the only one, or one of the only ones.
For many years, he had such an interesting life. He didn't finish high school till he was 21 because he had to work. And he also had to support his mother. His father had left New Orleans and gone to New York for his own different reasons, so the family was really without much of an income. And so all of the older children had to help the mother support the younger children. My father was more on the younger end of the family, and so he had older siblings who could also help. He always sent money home to his mother. Mm-hmm. But he did work, and he finished high school at 21. He never went to undergraduate school. He took courses and did some studies with some professors. but he did a lot of reading and working, and he worked at the law library for many, many years. And then he entered law school, went at night for 2 years, finally he finished law school at the age of 26.
Without the undergraduate degree?
Yes.
Just studying on his own.
I think
Amazing.
he probably just went to law school.
Okay.
And he did very well. He graduated with honors, and as a result of his academic performance at Howard, he received a significant collection or library of law books, which he brought back to Louisiana. And I remember dusting those in his office many times. And he established himself as a civil attorney, but he had to work as a clerk in the customs house, which was in charge of all of the ports of Texas, Louisiana, and Florida. And in New Orleans, the customs house is a huge 1-block square building that's a federal building that handled all of the ports of the southern tier of the United States. And he was a clerk liquidator, so he had to know maritime law, what could come into the country, what you had to take off the ships and keep in storage and stuff like that. He did that until he was 42 years old, until he could finally afford to practice law full time.
So in all that time that he wasn't taking any civil rights cases? Or
Oh,
anything?
yes, he was active. He was always active from the moment he entered law school with the foundation of the NAACP, which was being organized in New York and the Eastern Coast. And he came to New Orleans. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was the legal organization in the country that was challenging segregation. And it was a fledgling organization at that time. And he was certainly very active and involved in that. And when he got to New Orleans, he became involved with the local chapter there. So although he wasn't in court, he was also always interested in pursuing cases that involved the civil rights of minorities. And he found out that the NAACP in New Orleans would although for many years he was the only black lawyer in the state, there were other lawyers when he got there, some older men who were lawyers. And he found that these black lawyers were never used to appear in court, that the NAACP actually had white lawyers go in and argue the cases for them. And he said, that's not acceptable.
Wow.
We are black lawyers, we are well trained, we can do our own presentations in court, and I will never have a white lawyer argue my case in court. And he changed that tremendously by staying there and becoming a black lawyer. And as I said, for many years he was the only black lawyer in the state. And he paved the way for other black lawyers to live and practice and have the respect of the adversaries and the judges in the courts in the South.
Right. And you say Thurgood Marshall was one of you, was like your uncle. You used to come and
Louisiana was very important. New Orleans was very significant legally for many reasons. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals was in New Orleans. Many of the Southern cases that were being tried in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s ended up on appeal at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which had jurisdiction over the whole Southern tier. And so those cases which was federal, those cases would be heard in New Orleans. And Thurgood Marshall and his team of lawyers would come to New Orleans to argue those cases and to file their briefs. And of course, my father was involved in all of those cases and argued many of them. Also argued one case, voting rights, a case which in 1947 was one of the first voting rights cases argued in the Supreme Court that he won, that allowed blacks to register to vote in Louisiana. So my father became the lead lawyer for the NAACP in Louisiana. And worked very closely with the entire legal staff from the New York office, and also became president of the Louisiana NAACP and so forth and so on. So he handled more in his 40 years of legal work. He handled more than 100 significant civil rights cases.
Now tell us about the case with LSU.
Yeah, well, the strategy for the NAACP in the 50s became very evident that they wanted, first of all, to attack education. And one of the big cases was equalization of teacher salaries. In Louisiana and many southern states, black teachers were paid half of what white teachers were paid. And that was a big case for my dad, worked with Thurgood Marshall, and they did equalize teacher salaries and in Louisiana. And then they started working on the graduate schools, suing the graduate schools, because although some of the southern states had black and white universities, like Louisiana had 2 black schools that were supported by the state, Southern University and Grambling. Blacks were not allowed to go to LSU or any of the white state institutions. But the black schools didn't have graduate schools. They didn't have law schools. They didn't have medical schools. So blacks had to go out of state. And to keep you from suing and integrating the white graduate schools, the state would pay you as a black person, give you a subsidy to go out of state to go to medical school or to law school. They didn't pay the whole freight, but it was an incentive to keep blacks from challenging the law. But Thurgood Marshall and the blacks in the country said, this is not acceptable. Why can't we have people go to school in the states they pay taxes for? And we also need legal representation in these states. Who's going to help the black people do the legal things that need to be done or the medical things that need to be done? So they started suing the graduate schools, and LSU in the 40s after the war, the law school was one of the first to be sued, and eventually blacks did enter the law school. In 1953, I was a high school student graduating from a black high school, and after much discussion with my family, I decided that I wanted to go to Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, which was not segregated at that time or not integrated at that time. And so my application to LSU was rejected, and I pursued legal action, and I was admitted to LSU as the first black undergraduate in 1953. And it was a big media event for the South and the state because it was before the Brown versus the Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court that ruled that segregation and separate but equal was illegal. So I was a year ahead of that decision, and also ahead of the cases in Mississippi and Alabama with James Meredith and Arthurine Lucy, who sued in subsequent years in the later 50s. So I was the first black to challenge a large white state institution that had been always white. And I went to LSU, and it was quite evident that the whole system did not want me to be there. The state didn't want me there. The university didn't want me there. The governor didn't want me there. The president of the university didn't want me there. The students didn't want me there. And the professors didn't want me there. So I had a very tough time. I lived on campus. I was there only for 8 weeks. It was quite a eye-opener as a 17-year-old who
You
had
say
lived
only 8 weeks, but it
I
was
only stayed 8 weeks.
8 weeks could be a lifetime. Oh my
It
gosh.
was a terrible experience because I was totally isolated, and I wasn't harmed physically. There was not that awareness. I think many times some of them didn't know who I was. They didn't identify me as a black person all the time until I mentioned who I was name-wise.
Well, you talk about something going to play ball or something.
Yeah, we had to play. I took PE, and it was handball, and so I would get there early and just go on the court. I never wanted to force myself on anyone, so I would go in early and I would be practicing on a court, and then the kids would come in and pair off, and one guy came in and said, "I'm so glad you're here because I don't want to play with that," and he used the N-word, and I didn't say anything. So the professor didn't check the roll until at the end of the class, because people could leave if they wanted to if he took it at the beginning. So at the end of the class we would all assemble and he'd check your name off. So when he said Tureaud, and everybody looked to see where he was. They knew they knew the name Tureaud, who had sued the university. So when I said here, the guy who played with me just like was devastated, because he said to me, you know, if anybody that gets to play with him or have anything to do with him is going to be blackballed by all the other people in the university. We want to get him out of here, and we're giving him the silent treatment. So forth and so on. So I just ignored him, and you know, I wasn't going to get into all that dialogue, but I wasn't going to force myself on anyone, and I wasn't looking for confrontation, and I wasn't there as a test case. I truly wanted to go to school, and had looked forward to college as a broadening experience. My parents were both college graduates. My mother was a pharmacist. She had also gone away to school at Howard. She's from New Orleans. And her family owned drugstores and things. And my father married up into a sort of a well-established family, being the poor boy from a working class family. But anyway, it was quite an experience. And I had to leave because there was a mistrial. The state had worked very hard at finding legal loopholes to get me out. And they did, and they asked that the case be tried by a 3-judge court instead of a 1-judge court. And so my preliminary injunction, which allowed me to stay there until the case went through all of its legal hurdles, I was forced to leave, which was a good thing for me.
Right, you said your father called and said it was bad news, and then you said, no, you know,
Yeah.
this is good news.
My family had to help me a lot there because I was very unhappy,
Oh, I can imagine.
Just isolated. I'm a social being. I like being with people, and I needed the support of this faculty. I mean, I was a freshman trying to figure out how to study and all of that. Nobody was going to help me. I couldn't be part of any study groups or anything. So I was very happy to leave there, and I left and I entered Xavier University, which is a black Catholic school in New Orleans, where my sister was attending, and many of my friends and neighbors, and I was able to live at home, and I stayed there for the rest of my undergraduate experience and had a wonderful college experience, and I went to Columbia University and got a master's.
Yeah. So you do come to New York then, because you come to Columbia University, so you leave Louisiana. And
Yes, I graduated from Xavier. I had a wonderful experience there. It took me a year to really get back, to not have to worry about going back to LSU. The case proceeded in the courts.
You mean just to calm down from everything that happened?
Yeah, to adjust to the emotional distraction that experience caused, and also to learn how to handle myself as a freshman in college, how to study, how to handle all of the work that you had to do, and how to catch up. I was 8 weeks late starting in the semester, and the professors at Xavier, although they weren't rejecting me like they were at LSU, they weren't that happy to have me come in a class 8 weeks late.
Right.
So I said, well, just let me try it. I'll do the best I can. And I got by with C's and so forth, and then went to summer school and picked up the extra credits. And then the following year, my sophomore year, I really began to learn how to study, could go into study groups and have people help me to learn how to manage volume of work you get in college. And I got very active. I didn't realize I had all of this political interest. Got very active in school politics and became president of my class for my sophomore, junior, and senior year.
Wow.
And served in the student government organization for all of that time, and went to national conferences representing the university. So I had a very grounded, excellent education. And then when I finished from Xavier, I decided that I wanted to go to graduate school. And but you know, when you're in a segregated environment, and when you're told that you're not as good or not as equal or not as smart, or you don't deserve this or you don't deserve that, as much as your family and your friends achieve and you feel good about yourself, you begin to wonder, well, am I competitive? And so when I was a junior at Xavier, I said to my father, I want to go away to summer school, but I want to go to a big Northeastern school, and I want to take a course or two just to see if I can compete in the total world experience. And so I went to Catholic U in Washington, D.C. I took 2 graduate courses. I'm still in undergraduate school. I took 2 graduate courses, and I did well.
All right.
And I had to prove to myself that I could do that. So when I got to be a senior and graduated, I had no fear of coming to Columbia and going to graduate school, and I did. And I was at Columbia from September to May, and I worked hard, and I got a master's in 2 semesters.
Wow.
Because I was ready to go to work.
Okay.
And I
A
didn't
master's in education?
I got
it?
a master's in vocational rehabilitation and counseling.
Okay.
There was a program that was being offered by the federal government to train counselors to work with veterans and so forth and so on. And I got a free education at Columbia from the federal government, and I was supposed to give them 3 years of work in a VA hospital.
Okay.
And I was with a study group of an American Indian, Elmo Cohen, from Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin, and a Jewish fellow, Jerry Fine, from New York City, and me.
Okay.
So we were like the United Nations group. And we graduated together, all 3 of us, and they asked us to go to, this was a new federal program out of the Department of Education. They paid our tuition and they gave us a stipend.
Wow.
So it was wonderful, and my father didn't have to pay for that. And so they asked us to go to Washington to meet with the Department of Education and the Secretary of Education, Health and Welfare, to talk about the program and be used as poster men for this program. And we did. And they offered, so they interviewed each one of us and the 3 of us, and we had a wonderful time. And then they had a private interview. Each one of us had a private interview. And Jerry Fine was offered a job at the Bronx VA Hospital. And Elmo Cohen was offered a job in Wisconsin. He was a Native American from one of the, I think it was Chippewa Indians or whatever. Wonderful guy. And when they called me and they said, Mr. Tureaud, we're very sorry, but we cannot offer you a job in Louisiana as a vocational counselor because all of the hospitals will not hire black vocational counselors. So I said, well, I do want to return home. So I said, well, you know, you're free and clear. You don't owe us anything.
Oh.
So I thought, here we go again. Segregation, you know, things need to change. So I did go back to New Orleans, and I taught for a while, and I served in the Army. And then I came to New York, got married and came to New York and worked in White Plains.
Okay.
In the public schools there, and I stayed there for 36 years.
In White Plains.
In White Plains. I taught for 8, and then I became...
And in between there, you changed your name. You became, instead of being, you
wanted
to be Alex.
Yeah,
right?
well, when I came, you know, when I left New Orleans, I decided I wanted to be in a different kind of experience. And instead of becoming AP Tureaud, I wanted to be myself and not to be just the son of this wonderful man. I loved my dad, but, oh, you're AP's son, you're AP,
Yeah.
you know. So I said, you know, I'm going to be Alex Tureaud. Nobody knows me. I've got to carve out my own future. And so, and my father never pressured me to be anything but myself. I was the only son. I have 5 sisters. But I felt that, so I said to him once, you know, I don't want to be a lawyer. He said, I never asked you to be a lawyer. Do what you want to do. That's what I want to do. And I never really knew exactly what I wanted to do, but I like working with kids, and I like education type things. So I taught White Plains High School for 8 years, and I became director of special ed. But I use Alex. I use my real name and not AP. So people in New York know me as Alex Tureaud, and people in Louisiana know me as AP.
Oh, they do know you as AP.
So when I hear somebody say AP, I know that they know my identity from, and it's fine. It's wonderful. I'm proud of it.
You just had a wonderful thing happen with LSU. Let's just
Oh,
go back
yeah.
there a
Oh.
minute, because how long did it take then before
58 years, yeah.
50? No, but I mean for
57 years.
for them to give you this award.
Well,
yeah, but once you're walking on the street and all of a sudden a bunch of newscasters come up to you because they finally resolved this.
When I was at Xavier in my junior year, I was on campus and I was going from one class to the other, and this mobile TV truck comes down the street, and are you AP Tureaud? And yes, I am. And they came out with the mics and things and said, well, the Supreme Court has ruled on many of the Southern cases that were being referred to them or whatever, and appealed to them. And your case was finally decided.
And how many years later is this?
Well, that was 3 years later.
3 years later.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
And so are you going back to LSU? And I said, no.
No.
I'm graduating from Xavier next year,
Right.
2 or 3 years. And but I'm glad that the case was decided because there are other people who may want to go to LSU. And although I wasn't doing it as a test case, all of the state universities should be open to any citizen who qualifies to go.
Absolutely.
So that was a closure for me.
Right.
And but then New York. When I came to New York and I really got involved in public education, I really enjoyed my career. And in 1988 at LSU, a group of many hundreds of students then from 1953 to 1988, hundreds of black students went to LSU. And I never told anybody in White Plains. I never shared that history with them. And the few people who knew me from New Orleans never mentioned it, so that people that worked with me for 15, 20 years didn't know anything about my background. And I was happy about that because I wanted to be me, and I made a career for myself, and got very involved in special ed advocacy and did a lot of work with the state, the county, federal government in helping to change the restrictions that were placed on handicapped children and their parents and make things more inclusive.
Okay.
So I did a lot of work. So all of a sudden I was seeing that my civil rights background was transferring to a human rights experience for handicapped people.
Right.
And I was enjoying that with legislation and inclusion and working with the state. I was on the governor's advisory panel for many years for special ed. So I got very involved. But I realized this was coming out of my background and my experiences that I had had as part of a family of activists.
Right.
So that was good. And in 1988, a group of graduates, black graduates from LSU, were forming an alumni chapter, and they named it after my dad, since he sued the university 13 times because they made him sue each graduate school separately to slow down the process of integration. And he did. He pursued it, and he did. And so they were forming a black alumni chapter, and they named it after my dad, and they were going to inaugurate the chapter at homecoming, and they were going to have a big celebration. And would I come down? And I thought, I don't know if I want to do that. That was painful. And I thought, well, no, maybe this will be a reconciliation for me and for them. There were new people there, new presidents, new chancellors, new staff, and all these black students, hundreds had, and they were honoring a man who helped open those doors for them.
And your father was not alive at this point?
No, he was not alive. He died in 1972 at the age of 73. So this was a number of years later, but his legacy was there. And so I came down and I spoke, and the university administrators and chancellor, it was a really high-profile experience, and there was a lot of crying, a lot of emotional things. And I gave LSU another opportunity for reconciliation, for me and for many others, and I didn't always represent just me, because there were hundreds of other people who had tried to desegregate many institutions in Louisiana. I was just fortunate to be one of the first in the black undergraduate program, in the undergraduate program. So I started, LSU began to invite me down for activities. They would call me down to speak. And symposium and stuff like that during Black History Month, of course, they would call me down. And then the black graduates said to the university, you don't have a building on campus named for any person of color. And you're building a new building that we think would be very interesting and significant to undergraduates. So they agreed to name it for a black person. And again, they named it for my dad.
Yeah. That was wonderful. And the statue, is it the statue in LSU?
The statue's in New Orleans, which I'll tell you about, but it's a long story short about LSU was they named the building for my dad. It's the A.P. Tureaud Classroom Building. It's a high-tech building, and a lot of freshmen and undergraduates use it. And my mother was alive at the time, and she was the one who pulled the string
Oh,
to
that's amazing.
so that was wonderful.
Yeah.
And then LSU asked, because of the building, students saying, well, who is A.P. Tureaud? So LSU Press asked my co-author, Rachel Emanuel, who had done a documentary on my dad as part of her doctoral thesis, if she would write a biography of my dad. And she said, I can't because I don't know enough about his family. So she asked me to co-author. We had become friends, and she asked me to co-author with her. And I said, well, I'd be happy to, but I don't really know enough about the background. And that's when all of this stuff began to be exposed, and the genealogy, and the slaves, and the history, and all of my dad's cases. And it took us 12 years, but we finally did it. And last year, after many starts and stops, LSU Press published our book, A More Noble Cause, and we had a wonderful launch at LSU with 500 or 600 people there and a lot of press and coverage. The book's been doing very well. And then a few days after the launch, I was still in Baton Rouge. I got a call from Dr. Michael Martin, who's the chancellor of LSU, and he said, we unanimously agreed to give you a doctorate this May, an honorary doctorate. So that was really quite astounding, and probably one of the most spectacular highlights of my public career.
I watched this. It's on the internet. You
It's
can
on
see
YouTube.
It's on YouTube. Yeah,
Mhm.
I'd like to.
Yeah.
I think at the end of the program, I'd like to maybe put how they can.
Yeah.
People can
Well,
go
if you
to
just
see
go
it.
YouTube and you do LSU commencement 2012, it'll come up. But
Yeah.
it was a wonderful event, and LSU is a very impressive school. I mean, they have like 30,000 students there, and they have campuses in different parts of the state, and so they've done, I think, a fantastic job. They've hired more black staff. There are thousands of black students now there. So, you know, things have changed. And for me to see all of this in my lifetime and be able to receive the recognition, not just for myself, but for all of the people that went before me and all of the people that came after me. You know, it was 10 years before, after I left in '53, it was almost 10 years before blacks felt comfortable enough to go in numbers to that school.
So in those 3 years, so it didn't happen. Didn't know
Because they were civil rights movement got very violent in the '60s, and
Mm-hmm.
blacks were being threatened and intimidated on campus. And then ACP realized that you can't send one or two people; you have to send groups, and you have to provide a lot of support for them, and so forth and so on. So it's a wonderful place now. And I go back frequently. I'm going back in a few weeks. And
You've been traveling around the country with
yes,
this book.
and next week I'm going to be at Stanford, and I've been in universities and libraries and law organizations and conventions.
Most recently, there's been an interesting story about a jail that just.
Yeah, so I just got an invitation to be a member, to be made an honorary member of the Louisiana Museum for Justice, which is, I didn't know anything about. It's a hall of fame for Angola Prison in Louisiana. Now, Angola Prison has been a very controversial prison for many years, but as I understand it, there's a new warden who's trying to improve the conditions there and to improve the relationships with the community and make it inclusive. Because, you know, in the South, you know, a lot of what we understand from history and so forth, some of it comes out of the media and the movies, and some of it may be true, but some of it may be exaggerated. Not that it was pleasant, but we have seen people trying to make things more inclusive, and so I agreed. And so in July of this year, I will go to Louisiana, to Baton Rouge, and be inducted into the Hall of Fame of the Museum of Justice.
Yeah, that's it.
So I'm happy to be able to accept these honors for the hundreds of people that made these things possible. None of this stuff was done by one person. It's always a group effort, and there's still work to be done.
Still work to be
Still
done.
work to be done.
Well, didn't you? Were you one of the people that said you'd like to eliminate Black History Month? You don't think it should
Well, you know, I understand. To me, it's a beginning. I get calls from people in February to do speaking engagements in Black History Month.
be right?
I think I'm a part of American history, and that's 12 months of the year.
Right.
And I think hopefully we will morph into American history and look at how we're presenting history as a more inclusive activity, not just for Black people, but for all of the people that make this country what it is. We're a
Right.
very mixed country of many nationalities, races, colors, and we all make contributions that make this country the great place it is.
Well, when your father was doing all of these, did he ever think that he felt threatened?
Turn this off.
Oh yeah. Did he feel that?
You know, my father was the most self-effacing, easygoing, regular guy. He came out of a family of very soft-spoken people. He never raised his voice. I never heard, there's 6 kids, well, I'm one of 6 kids. I never heard my father raise his voice to any of us. And he was always willing to see it your way or encourage you to do things. He never talked about the opposition, which was volatile.
Will you tell a story about him going to a dinner once where
Yeah.
he was not?
In the, I guess it had to be the 60s, the Louisiana Bar Association, which was basically all white, moved their meetings to the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. You know, if you go east of New Orleans, you could be in Mississippi soon along the Gulf of Mexico. So they moved it to the Gulf Coast, thinking that Black lawyers wouldn't want to go to Mississippi because Mississippi had such a terrible reputation. Well, we knew the Gulf Coast. We had a little summer cottage in Pasquistan, Mississippi. But my father wasn't intimidated by that kind of thing. And so my father got a group. He was then in his senior years. He was in his 60s then. And he got a group of young lawyers. Now, by then, Black lawyers had been graduating from the law schools that he helped integrate and so forth and so on. So he mentored a lot of the young lawyers who were coming along. And he also had 2 young lawyers who were junior law partners of his. One became the first Black mayor of the city of New Orleans, Ernest Dutch Moria. So he took a group of guys with him to Louisiana bar meeting in Mississippi, and when they got there, it was 6 or 7 of them. They had them in a separate dining room from the white lawyers. So the young guys, they were all in their 30s and whatever. They were like most young people. They weren't going to put up with that. And so they said to my dad, "We're not staying. We're going to let them get everything together and so forth, and we're leaving." So I said, "But yeah, but you know, you came on your own, you were not invited, you joined this organization, you came." He said, "That's impolite. Let them know by letter or tell them that they shouldn't be doing these things, and let's try to work out together a better situation." No. So they left in protest. My father stayed. Now, maybe as a young person I would have left in protest too, because my father and I had some discussions about the 60s and the marches and all of that and the sit-ins and so forth. He believed in the legal procedures, not street demonstrations and things. I believed in both because I think one pushed the other. But anyway, so my father sat there in the room by himself. One of the white judges who was there, who knew my dad, saw him sitting in the room by himself. And he said, "Tureaud, what are you doing here?" Now, my father had, people respected him even though they may not have agreed with his suing the state or the universities, judges and lawyers. They respected him because of the way he conducted himself as a human being and a lawyer. And so this guy who was a lawyer who had become a judge knew my dad, and he said, "What are you doing in here?" He said, "Well, that's where they put me." He said, "No. Tell the people to bring my dinner in here. I'm going to sit in here with you." I think the room they put him in was near the men's room. So a few other lawyers were getting up to go to the men's room, so they saw this judge and my dad, and what are you guys doing in here? So, well, they put Tureaud in here because he's black. Oh, no, 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 no. So by the end of the meeting, there were 6 or 7 of them having dinner. And, you know, I knew that they had, the young lawyers who are now men who are retired, and one of them became the first black Supreme Court justice, Revius Ortiz. One became the first black mayor. One became the first federal judge. So they were men who achieved great things in Louisiana, and they were mentored by my dad. But he was just the kind of guy who.
Well, that was a good example for them,
Yeah.
wasn't it?
And he said to them, you know, you can work this out with people. He would compromise. He said, meet me halfway. When he was fighting the desegregation of the New Orleans public schools in 1960, which was his largest case, I mean, you know, he opened up all of the public schools in Louisiana, all of the public transportation, all of the state schools and vocational schools. I don't know how he did all of those things. Now, he didn't do them alone. He did them in concert with the NAACP support from New York and local people and so forth. But most of the time, all those cases came out of his office, and many of the briefs he would type himself. I used to see him sitting at his typewriter. Although he had clerical help, he would do this stuff himself. He was, but he was respected. He would go into court, and he always respected the judges and his opposition. And I know people who challenged him, but they didn't treat him disrespectfully. And to me, that just amazed. And he never got angry with anyone. He never rallied. The only time I heard him curse once was when I was home for a visit, and he had retired because he had cancer. And he was still able to move around, but he said, come on, I have something I want to do. Check. My father started an archive of black history, and he was interested in historical stuff, so he was collecting stuff on his own. Plus, he kept all of his papers, and his papers are at the Amistad Research Center, which tells the history of a lot of stuff in the book comes out of his collection. But so he said, I have to go down to the courthouse, and one of his junior law partners, Dutch Tureaud, who became the first black mayor, was then the first juvenile court judge that had been appointed in the history of Louisiana. So we go in, and he said, I want you to see, they called Ernest Tureaud Dutch. We'll go see Dutch. I said, Dad, he's sitting in court. Oh, he just wants to say hello to you. He walks in the courtroom, Dutch sees him, stop, says hello to my dad, and we say hello. And then we go out, and he gets what he needs to get. And coming down the corridor, this white lawyer's coming, and he sees my dad, and he walks up to my dad and says, hello, Tureaud. Everybody called him Judge or Tureaud. Tureaud, how you doing? My father says, I'm doing okay. Now, my father looked terrible. He had lost weight. His color wasn't good. So he said, this guy said to him, you don't look so hot, man. You look like you're working too hard. You've lost a lot of weight. And he said, oh, yeah, okay. And then he walked away. So he said, damn fool.
That was it?
That was it. He said, damn fool, doesn't he know I've got cancer? So I said, Dad, he doesn't know. He wouldn't have said that.
Doesn't sound like much of a curse to me. But
no, but, you know, but even through the months that he suffered tremendously, bedridden, he was interviewed by a professor from University of New Orleans, Joe Logsdon. And for 40 hours, he told his life story from the time he was a child up to the current. And all of this material we had access to.
It was on tape? It was on tape, not video, just on tape.
No, it was just on tape. Yeah. And we found it after 30 years and used it for the book. And, you know, it was stories I never heard. I didn't know a lot about his childhood. I didn't know about all of that experience going to Chicago and being in vaudeville and all of that. So it was amazing. Yeah. So my co-author and I said, you know what, this book was destined to be written.
Right, yeah. And so
it was destined.
Yeah. It's an amazing story, Alex.
It's such a rich culture, and it's a good experience because it shows that even though there are restrictions placed against you, you can do the right thing to change that, and that one person working with others can make a difference, and that we all have to make things better, and that prejudice is unacceptable under any circumstances. And art is a way, and literature and education is a way to make things better. So I've had a marvelous experience, and I'm still having it, and I'm enjoying the whole sharing. I've talked to so many people in elementary schools, high schools, universities. I've spoken to lawyers associations, to conventions. We had a big book talk at the Louisiana State Supreme Court. We had a big book talk at the plantation where my family started. I mean, how could anybody have all these experiences?
And we're going to end right now, this talk that you've given to us, which we so much appreciate.
Well, thank you so much for asking me. And I just wanted to say something about the two paintings. I guess the reason and you know, I'm a non-trained artist. I just paint out of my own interest. I think for me, a lot of, and the figures melting into the background, is to allow myself and the people looking at what I create to decide how they want to interpret what they see.
All right. That's great. That's where we started. That's where we'll end.
Well, thank you so much for this.
Thank you. And thank you for watching.